You know, I was just getting ready to step out when I refreshed my YouTube homepage and saw that The Drinker had just put out a new video. This one is on the DC Universe production hell. It is entitled The Entire DCEU. This should be interesting. Let's get it.
You know, normally my production hell videos tend to focus on one particular project that was notoriously difficult to get made, either because of creative differences behind the scenes, issues with the cast and crew, difficult shooting conditions, or just all-round generalized insanity. The history of filmmaking is littered with stories like that, and not only can they teach us valuable lessons about how not to make movies, but they're also pretty damn funny to point and laugh at. But there are some screw-ups so monumental, so unfathomably huge that they can't be confined to a single movie or TV show, and instead spill out to encompass an entire franchise spanning more than a dozen projects over a span of almost a decade. I'm talking, of course, about DC on film.
I'll tell you this, and if they hadn't, like I always say, if they hadn't been trying to catch Marvel and just ran their own freaking race, I think they would have been fine. You were in panic mode the whole time, DC, trying to catch Marvel. You didn't see what they had earlier when they started, or once they started to blow up, and it was like, we can't be left behind. We're DC. Yes, you're DC. Run your own race, because when DC shows up properly and they do it right, they ain't got to worry about catching Marvel, because it'll catch it all by itself.
Are known as the DCEU, the grand plan that was going to rival Marvel, which turned out to be one of the biggest creative and commercial disasters, not to mention wastes of talent in all of Hollywood history. It was an epic tale of greed, envy, creative mismanagement, alliances, backstabbings and hubris. So settle in with a glass of something smooth and intoxicating, because The Drinker is about to tell you the story of DC on film. Now, the idea for a shared cinematic DC universe wasn't exactly a new one. In fact, way back in the late 1990s when Warner were still...
Let me tell you something. I truly believe that would have been a horrible flop. Nick Cage, I love him, he's a great actor, but Nick Cage, Superman, the long hair, I've seen the documentary on the making of it. I'm telling you, I got it just real bad. Most of the time when I have a gut feeling about a movie and it's going to be flop or be trash or whatever, I'm right. All right? I'm not saying that it wouldn't have been a major hit, but they were trying to make lightning strike twice because he did Batman, so then they were having Tim Burton do Superman. I do not think it would have worked. Now, let's continue.
Trying to get a Nick Cage Superman movie off the ground, and check out my video on that disaster if you want to know how it's possible to blow $30 million without shooting a single frame. Yeah. There was already talk of a possible crossover with the Joel Schumacher Batman movies, possibly even leading into a Justice League team-up. One can only imagine the delights of Nick Cage teaming up with the campiest Batman since Adam West. Anyway, needless to say, nothing came of this grand concept, and Warner quickly abandoned it to focus on solo Superman and Batman movies. But hey, nothing rejuvenates old ideas quicker than someone else making money out of them, and the meteoric rise of the MCU in the early 2010s was enough to get Warner executives thinking once again. Hey, this whole shared universe thing seems to be working out pretty well for Marvel. We should have one of our own. Great idea, friend, but we need to get it up and running fast because Marvel are way ahead and we've got a lot of catching up to do. Agreed. Bring me someone who can make that happen. And as it turned out, the man they picked for the job was Snyder. Now, I think in retrospect, most of us would probably agree that Snyder, well, how can I put this diplomatically, might not have been the optimal choice for a role like this.
Before he even goes into it, I'm going to tell you this, and I've said this before. I think Snyder was great for this. I think they originally wanted Nolan, since he did the Dark Knight trilogy, why wouldn't he have continued with his, from what I understand, and I remember reading this, the darker, gloomier Superman was right in sync and what they wanted, because they wanted a darker, because Nolan did a darker, grittier Batman, more grounded, realistic Batman. They wanted to do the same thing with Superman. So that's why we got what we got. I still enjoyed it personally. I was fine with it. I understood the man being down. The whole world's talking about him, hating him, some loving him, don't know what to do with him. He's a scary alien with godlike power. Kind of makes sense as in a grounded reality. If I saw a dude fly past, ripping roofs off buildings with his amazing power of flight, and seeing him lifting shit and doing all this stuff, and I'd be worried too. Who knows what the hell could happen? But anyway, I think he had a great plan. I think he still has a great plan. And we all saw when they didn't cut his wings and they let him fly on his own and do what he wanted to do. We saw with Zack Snyder's Justice League exactly what the man had in store of us. And people agree unanimously that it was better than that big old piece of trash that we saw that we let Joss Whedon put out in the damn theaters. Shut up. All right? Now, I'm going to let the drinker go. I may have to pause. Defend my boy. All right? Let's get it there. I ain't going to always agree with everything with the drinker. I agree with most, though.
But 10 years ago, it was a pretty different story, and in a lot of ways, he actually had a lot to recommend him as a director. He'd had a string of well-received movies. He excelled at producing dark, gritty, violent films that would stand in sharp contrast to the bright colours and chirpy humour of the MCU. And in theory, all of this would allow DC to position itself as the cool, mature, and edgy alternative to Marvel. Now, you might think that Snyder would have been a logical fit to direct a dark, gritty, violent Batman movie, which would have been right up his alley. Yeah. So, of course, Warner did the exact opposite and put him in charge of a Superman film. Man of Steel turned out to be the movie that would launch the new DC universe on film, and while Henry Cavill's casting was generally well received, Snyder's brooding, conflicted take on the character wasn't, and Man of Steel earned a lukewarm reception at the box office. But don't worry, worse was yet to come. A lot worse. See, Snyder's plan was to do a sequel to Man of Steel first, and then introduce Batman based on The Dark Knight Returns, followed by a team-up with the other members of the Justice League in an epic two-part storyline that would culminate in the death of Superman's story from the comics. Fair enough, but Warner executives weren't happy with this plan.
Nope.
Marvel had already had their first big Avengers team-up film that went on to make $1.5 billion, and naturally, they wanted a piece of the action.
Yep.
There wasn't time to introduce each...
Hence, not running their own race.
Character in their own movies and patiently build up the franchise.
Why would they put all of that together? They mashed in the death of Superman with all that. I was just like, they didn't have to do that. That's its own thing. The death of Superman is its own thing. You know what I mean? Whatever.
Like they should have done, they wanted results, and fast.
Yeah.
And so, Man of Steel 2 morphed into Batman vs. Superman, a film that would introduce not one, but two of the biggest storylines in DC history, as well as being a backdoor intro for Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Cyborg, and The Flash. And if this all sounds like a lot of work to put on the second movie in a franchise, well, that's because it was.
Yes.
You don't need me to tell you that Batman vs. Superman was a shit show.
I actually really liked it, though. I did. Well, even with what they did, I didn't like all the mashing and cramming of everybody in there. I still love that movie till this day. I actually like that movie, the director's cut, the ultimate cut. I like that more than I do the theatrical version. The theatrical version is a Batman movie co-starring Superman. The director's cut is a Superman movie co-starring Batman. And I really like those two contrasts if you watch them both back to back. I've never watched them back to back, but one day, one the other day. You really get a different feeling in both movies. So I love them both. And I still love them both to this day. Could they have been better? Yes. If they had let Zack do what he wanted to do, I think they would have been better. And we wouldn't have got the things that pissed people off. And we got the best damn Batman fight we've ever seen, period, point blank, on the silver screen. That rhyme, don't hate to play at the game. Bars!
It was too long, too bloated and convoluted. The conflict between the two leads didn't make much sense. The tone was bleak and depressing, and the introduction of Wonder Woman felt tacked on and distracting. The failure of Batman vs Superman sent shockwaves through Warner Brothers, who were convinced that they had a mega hit on their hands. It was clear to the studio heads that Snyder's bleak, somber, grim-dark take on the franchise wasn't working out, and they needed to change course drastically.
Yeah, it wasn't his take that was the problem.
Funnier and shorter. Basically, they needed to be just like the MCU, the very thing that they were supposed to be against.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people like the Suicide Squad, but they just don't do it for me. Their screen representations don't do it for me. They put a bad taste in my mouth. I didn't like the Suicide Squad, and I didn't like the first movie either. Although I thought the second movie was better, but I hella loved Peacemaker. But my point is, their screen representations don't work for me. Which shoots over to the video game. I highly doubt I'm gonna get it. Because I don't know, I find the characters really irritating. I get why a lot of people like them. I get it. This whole this whole ragtag group of misfits, and I get it, but they don't work for me. I'm definitely gonna have to see some gameplay on that and see if I'm gonna get that.
And the casualties began to mount straight away. Suicide Squad, which was pretty much in the can by this point, was subjected to extensive reshoots.
And I still want to see the Ayer cut, because I think Leto's Joker had promise. I do, and I think they don't want to show us because they know that with what they did with Justice League, with how it backfired in their faces explosively, it's going to happen the same way with the Ayer cut. And we're going to see a Joker that we like, and we're going to see a movie that we like. That's what I think.
Re-edits in a desperate attempt to shorten the length, inject more humour and ramp up the pace. The resulting Frankenstein's monster of a film was practically disowned by director David Ayer, who was rightly pissed off at having his created vision flushed down the pan, and heavily criticised by fans who to this day are campaigning for the original cut to be released.
That's right.
The only point of hope for DC on film was the surprise success of Wonder Woman, which had been largely insulated from the fallout of Batman vs Superman, and enjoyed a relatively trouble-free production. And its success cemented the idea that the only way forward was to ditch the bleak nihilism of the Snyder movies and focus more on optimism, warmth, heart, and positive heroic characters. Unfortunately, one good movie wasn't enough to keep the franchise going, and an even bigger disaster was on the horizon. Justice League was intended to be the biggest movie of the franchise so far, bringing in all the major players for an epic battle that would eclipse even the Avengers. The only problem is that Warner were now in full-on panic mode after the failure of Batman vs Superman, desperately trying to course correct, and their attempts to get Snyder to produce a shorter, funnier and lighter cut of the film were a bit like asking Sarah Silverman to make something that isn't shit. And when personal tragedy forced Snyder to drop out of post-production, Warner seized the opportunity to bring in a man who could give them their own personal version of the Avengers. Imaginatively enough, the man who made the fucking Avengers in the first place. It was a desperation move by a studio lurching from one disaster to another, groping for a solution to a problem that they didn't fully understand. And even if they did, Whedon was given neither the time nor the resources to properly fix the movie. An overweight and alcoholic Ben Affleck was brought back in for hastily organised reshoots, and no amount of makeup and wardrobe could hide the fact that he was out of shape and disinterested in the part. Henry Cavill, who was in the middle of filming Mission Impossible, was refused permission to shave off his moustache, resulting in possibly the most hilariously terrible CGI job in history.
There it is. I knew he was going to show the one with him baring his teeth. I knew it.
Ultimately, the best that Whedon could manage was a bodge job that satisfied nobody, ballooned the budget to over $300 million, and resulted in a Frankenstein's monster of a film that was very clearly two different movies made by two different directors, awkwardly forced together. Justice League was an absolute failure commercially and got savaged by fans and critics alike. By this point, the DCEU was pretty much in freefall. Plans to make a solo Batman movie.
And I think when I first saw it, I gave it a 4, and then I ended up dropping it to a 3. I remember that. It was just like average at that point. I was just like, after I settled into it, I was just like, it's like a 3.
Movie with Ben Affleck fell apart, and Ben used the opportunity to quietly exit the franchise. There were also growing rumours that Henry Cavill was out as Superman, with no plans to develop further movies with him. And it wasn't just actors that were dropping out either. John Berg and Jeff Johns, the 2 executives put in charge of the franchise after Snyder's exit, were also shuffled out the door after
God,
the
I ain't heard Jeff Johns' name in a while associated with this.
Justice League farce. Replacing them was Walter Hamada, who had a new plan for DC on film, to rebuild the franchise around a more diverse cast of central superheroes. Batman and Superman would be written out and replaced with their female counterparts, Batgirl and Supergirl, and they would join Wonder Woman as the 3 central pillars of the new and inclusive DCEU, with Harley Quinn also getting her own series of films. Lovely stuff.
You just hear the toilet flushing right now, don't you? As he's narrating this and you see everything getting worse.
The only problem is that all these things would take years to implement, and in the meantime, they still had hundreds of millions of dollars tied up in movies currently in development, and they couldn't afford to just shit-can them. That sort of thing would come later. So instead, the DCEU would go through a period of transition, focusing more on solo movies with no particular overarching storyline to tie them together, while they prepared to launch their new and inclusive version of the franchise. And what's interesting is that some of these movies ended up doing pretty well. Aquaman somehow managed to gross over $1 billion, becoming the highest grossing movie of the entire DCEU, although fuck me, I'll never understand how or why people went to see it. And although Shazam...
You know why I liked it? I really liked the special effects. Something about the look of it really captivated me. And my favorite scene is when they're diving and all of them... I love that part. I thought the story was good, and I just thought it was a really good looking movie. You know, I don't watch it a lot. I've only watched it a couple times. I bought it on 3D. You know what I mean? And I love watching it, but I don't watch it a lot. You know what I mean? But I still think it's a good movie.
Was a more modest success financially. Its small budget and positive reception were enough to greenlight a sequel. The end result of all these shenanigans was a weirdly confusing picture where films with low expectations turned out to be big hits, while the crowd-pleasing tentpole movies they needed to anchor their franchise kept failing miserably. Complicating things even further were standalone movies like Joker, which turned into mega successes against small budgets, finally earning them the critical and commercial success they desperately wanted, but impossible to incorporate into the larger DCEU. 2020 would end up being a turning point for Walter Hamada's new vision. Birds of Prey, the movie intended to launch Harley Quinn as a major player in the franchise, turned out to be a massive critical and commercial flop. And looking back, I think it's pretty obvious that the studio badly overestimated 2 important things: the popularity of Harley Quinn as a character, and the star power of Margot Robbie. And if that wasn't bad enough, it was followed up by Wonder Woman 1984. See, the success of the first movie had freed up director Patty Jenkins to have more creative control over the sequel, including writing the script, which again, in hindsight, proved that the studio badly overestimated 2 things: her ability to write compelling stories, and her ability to direct competent action scenes. Either way, Wonder Woman 1984 got scathing reviews, largely killing off the goodwill towards the character, and the unspecified virus of unknown origin effectively killed its chances at the box office. And if all that wasn't bad enough, a ghost from DC's past was about to come back to haunt them. See, ever since the Justice League debacle, there had been a growing online movement for the studio to release the original Zack Snyder version of the movie. Naturally, this was not a thing Warner were keen to do, because if it happened to be a big success, it would only underline the magnitude of their own fuck-up with how the film was managed. But that all changed conveniently enough when AT&T bought them over, and because they needed something to put on their new HBO Max streaming service, the Snyder Cut was brought back from the dead like a fucking zombie and released in March 2021. Now, from a filmmaking point of view, I have to admit that it's kind of fascinating to compare the 2 wildly different versions, but from a commercial perspective, it was an absolute disaster for DC. Releasing what amounted to a competing project that even teased the possibility of further film development only served to fragment an already divided fan base, undermining Warner's own plans for the future and making them look like a studio at war with themselves. But hey, there was at least one tiny cause for optimism on the horizon. James Gunn, who was taking a hiatus from Marvel after some uncomfortable old tweets resurfaced, was lured over to DC to make a sequel to the Suicide Squad. I mean, I say sequel, but it was more like a soft reboot, replacing most of the main characters and basically starting again. Either way, it was a big hit with fans, and even if it didn't make too much money because of the pandemic, it showed what Gunn could do with DC properties. And keep that one in mind because it's going to be important later. Anyway, it was becoming pretty obvious that things needed to change, and fast. The DCEU had been meandering without much sense of direction ever since Justice League. Walter Hamada's vision for a female-led franchise wasn't looking so appealing after Birds of Prey and Wonder Woman 1984, and most important of all, the studio was running out of money. The merger between Warner and Discovery finally brought this change in the shape of David Zaslav, the new CEO of Warner Discovery. Zaslav had a reputation as a hard-nosed businessman who took no shit and was willing to do whatever it took to get things back on track. And after reviewing Hamada's plans for DC on film, he promptly decided, fuck this, and took a scythe to the whole thing. Aquaman 2, Black Adam and The Flash were too far along in development to be cancelled, but as for the rest of their film and TV projects, it was an absolute bloodbath. Supergirl was axed, and so was an almost finished Batgirl, not to mention Legends of Tomorrow, Stargirl, Batwoman, and Batman Beyond. He also began a search for someone to oversee all future DC projects moving forward, realising at last that what they really needed was their own version of Marvel's Kevin Feige. And as it happens, his attention soon came to rest on James Gunn. Remember him? Well, he'd impressed the studio with his work on the Suicide Squad, and since he was coming to the end of his tenure at Marvel, they were able to bring him in to oversee future projects. As for Black Adam, any hope whatsoever of salvaging the DCEU in its current form pretty much rested on its shoulders. The plan was for it to act as a kind of soft reboot, acknowledging past events but mostly being used to usher in a new phase of DC movies. The Rock had kind of a reputation by this point as a franchise saver, and he lobbied hard to get Henry Cavill involved to set up future Superman movies. Finally, it seemed like DC were getting their act together. Unfortunately, Black Adam failed to take off at the box office, and with it went any real hope of salvaging DC on film, and not long after, the cancellations began. Henry Cavill was out as Superman just weeks after announcing his return to the role, Gal Gadot was out as Wonder Woman, Black Adam 2 was cancelled. Basically, James Gunn was cleaning house, doing a hard reboot of DC on film. The only movies to escape this cancellation were the ones almost ready for release, although you have to wonder who's going to bother watching films that have no possible way forward once they come out. The release of Aquaman 2 at the end of this year is going to effectively represent the final installment of the DCEU as it was intended. And with that ends what may be the most poorly managed, badly implemented wastes of talent and potential in the whole history of Hollywood. A franchise that pretty much stands as a textbook example of what not to do when you're trying to launch an extended universe. And I think if I had to pin down the reasons for its failure, I'd probably list 3 main flaws. 1. Hiring the wrong creatives. What this franchise needed was someone with a strong creative vision that would cover the next several years at least, who also understood and respected the characters they'd be working with. And in retrospect, Zack Snyder wasn't that guy. His style was...
He was that guy. I gotta disagree, Drinker. He was that guy. They didn't let him do his thing.
Too dark, too bleak, too nihilistic, and too divisive for a franchise like this. Number 2, playing catch-up. Instead of launching with a well-developed plan of their own, Warner waited until Marvel
Definitely
had scored
agree
a
with
massive
you on
hit
that.
with the Avengers, and from then on, it was a frantic race to catch up to them. Their eagerness to release their own big event movie led to them rushing and condensing storylines together, tripping over their own feet, and producing substandard products that push people away instead of drawing them in. Number 3, constant course correction. A string of early failures threw the studio into panic and chaos and led to a revolving door of senior executives,
Like they were
each with
driving a
different
car like
visions
this.
for what the franchise should be, none of whom really had the time to properly implement their ideas. This led to a series of wild swings in different directions creatively, forcing results in hasty reshoots and re-edits as movie directors struggle to keep up with conflicting ideas. Unlike Marvel, who charted a consistent creative direction and stuck to it, DC stumbled from flop to unexpected hit with no idea of what they needed to do. And the sad thing about all this is that they had most of the elements they needed to succeed. They had some of the best superhero characters in history, they had a strong cast of mostly good actors who were perfect for the roles, and they had legions of devoted fans just waiting to see their favourite comic book moments brought to life. But ultimately, they failed to capitalise on any of these things, and the end result was a decade of time and hundreds of millions of dollars wasted. Maybe James Gunn is going to be the franchise saviour that everyone hopes he'll be, or maybe he'll be just another entry in a long line of short-lived creatives who came and went before they really got a chance to make their ideas reality. Either way, none of that changes the fact that the DCEU truly was production hell. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.
Oh, man. Good job, Drinker. Very, very, very good job on this. Man, oh, man. I do really personally think if they let him do his thing, didn't cut his wings and cut the time on the movies and, you know, put out some epics, some 2.5 hour stuff, some 2.5, 3 hour epics, I think we could have got things done with these movies. And, you know, I think there's too many cooks in the kitchen. Fear, with making decisions based on fear and trying to catch Marvel. That's what I think. You know what I mean? So, you know, I think Man of Steel is a great movie. Batman v Superman, the ultimate version, is a great movie. And, but they didn't release the ultimate version. Got what I'm saying? They didn't release the ultimate version. And then we know what they did with Justice League. And Suicide Squad didn't work. They hacked that up. You see what I'm saying? Like, there was too many decisions made, fear-based decisions made based on trying to catch Marvel. And when you handcuff a dude or dudes, Ayer and, you know, Snyder, that is what you get. So, you know, post comments down below. Let me know what you all think. Make sure you go over to the Drinker and subscribe and tell them Tyrone Magnus sent you. 10 million subscribers. Woo!